Now, the second demand has been the most controversial in the BDS call. Many liberal Zionists jumped at it and said, but you're asking for full equality in Israel. Aren't you really intending to destroy Israel? Isn't that the point? You want to destroy Israel. I was actually asked that question at the University of Manchester in the UK by an ultra-right-wing Zionist. And I told him, what do you mean? Full equality destroys Israel? What does that say about Israel? If any system is destroyed when you have full equality, did full equality destroy South Africa? Did full equality destroy the southern states in the United States? When segregation was ended, at least by law, it was ended. So equality never destroys people. It never destroys their existence. It destroys a racist system. So that's exactly what we're targeting. In the same vein, all the arguments against BDS being accused of wanting to delegitimize Israel, what does that mean exactly? I mean, why is the divestment from Sudan not delegitimizing Sudan? It's delegitimizing Sudan's oppression in Darfur and war crimes in Darfur. And every other boycott and every other divestment campaign had a clear target. It's only when it comes to Israel where this delegitimization of the state comes up as if it's a unique case in history, outside of history, in fact. But despite that, what's this charge of apartheid, which I mentioned earlier? The system of racial discrimination that Israel practices within the state itself constitutes apartheid. Many have spoken about Israel practicing apartheid in the occupied territories. Professor John Dugard, international law expert, Richard Falk, many Israeli ministers, members of Knesset, Shulamit Aloni, many have accused Israel of practicing apartheid within the occupied territories. In fact, an Israeli attorney general, Michael Ben Yair, wrote in 2002, "We enthusiastically chose to become a colonial society, ignoring international treaties, expropriating lands, transferring settlers from Israel to the occupied territories, engaging in theft, and finding justification for all these activities. In effect," he says, "we established an apartheid regime in the occupied territories." So this is not very controversial, that Israel in the occupied territories is practicing apartheid. A South African study by the Human Sciences Research Center that was supervised by John Dugard reached that same conclusion, that Israel is practicing occupation, colonialism, as well as apartheid. But when it comes to Israel itself, not the occupied territories, that's when the controversy comes up. Are you comparing Israel with South Africa? Are you saying Israel is identical to South Africa, despite all the differences and the fact that Palestinians can vote in Israel and so on? Apartheid is not a matter of opinion, actually. So we don't care what Zionists think. It's irrelevant. There are objective criteria in international law. There's a UN Convention on the suppression and punishment of the crime of apartheid, and the 2002 Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court that define the crime of apartheid. I'll just read very quickly some of that definition. The UN Convention on the Suppression and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid describes the purpose of apartheid is establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group of persons over any other racial group of persons, and systematically oppressing them, in particular by means such as segregation, expropriation of land, and denial of the right to leave and return to their country, the right to a nationality, and the right to freedom of movement and residence." End of quote. Israel fits the bill exactly. In the 2002 Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the crime of apartheid is further defined as inhumane acts committed in the context of an institutionalized regime of systematic oppression and domination by one racial group over other racial groups or groups, and committed with the intention of maintaining that regime. Again, fits the bill. Nothing there that it has to be identical to South Africa. It does not have to be. There are many examples of Israeli apartheid. I'll just give a couple in the interest of time. The nationality and citizenship, two-tiered system in Israel. Israel is the only country on earth that maintains a system of citizenship and nationality that are not the same. If you're a citizen, you're not necessarily a national. To become a national of the state of Israel, you have to be Jewish. Non-Jews who are born in Israel and live there all their lives are never nationals of the state. In fact, some liberal Zionists went as far as the Supreme Court to challenge that, to try to strike from their IDs their identification of nationality. They had Jews under nationality, and they wanted to be identified as Israelis, not as Jews. And the Supreme Court rejected that. So it's rejected by the Knesset, by the Supreme Court. The entire establishment rejects that. So Israel is the only country that does not recognize its own nationality, because it defines itself as a state of the Jewish people, the Jewish nation, whatever that abstract term means. The point is, if Israel were to recognize an Israeli nationality, it would immediately equate between Jews and non-Jews. And that would end the apartheid nature of Israel. So Zionists wouldn't want that, obviously. And there are many, many other examples, the most important of which is land ownership. Palestinians in Israel cannot own land on 93% of the area of the state land of Israel through many, many measures, the Jewish National Fund being one, but the Israeli Land Administration is also another very important tool of enforcing that effective measure against Palestinian ownership. But while there's so much discussion and debate about Israeli apartheid, some liberal Zionists started talking about fascism in Israel. Thank you. It won't help much because I'm totally congested. So while this discussion about apartheid is ongoing, within so-called liberal Zionist circles inside Israel, there's increasing discussion about the rise of fascism. This especially came to the fore after the passage of the loyalty oath. According to this loyalty oath, non-Jews applying for Israeli citizenship would have to pledge allegiance to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. Jews applying do not have to, because many ultra-Orthodox sects do not recognize Israel as a Jewish state for religious reasons. So they don't make them take that allegiance. It's only for non-Jews, i.e. Palestinians. After that loyalty oath, some liberal Zionist thinkers, intellectuals, artists started talking about the rise of fascism in Israel. In fact, they issued a declaration of independence from fascism, which more than 150 major figures in Israel signed on to. One particularly important figure, award-winning academic Gabriel Solomon, went as far as comparing today's Israel to Germany in the 1930s. He said, quote, "The idea of Judenrein, a Jew-free zone, or Arab Rhine is not new. Some might say, how can you compare us to Nazis?" And he says, "I'm not talking about the death camps, but about the year 1935. There were no camps yet, but there were racist laws. And we are heading forward toward these kinds of laws. The government is clearly declaring our incapacity for democracy." End of quote. Another very well-known writer, Sefi Rachlevsky, differed just on the time frame of that comparison. He wrote, quote, "The struggle today is not between left and right, but between Democrats and fascists. Israel is becoming fascist and racist. In a sense, you could say we're more like not the madness that was in Germany in 1933, but in 1944-45. When they were in danger of losing the war, the Germans that is, madness prevented them from stopping." End of quote. So I don't think you'll see much of that debate in Israeli mainstream media, in US mainstream media. In Israel, this is in Yedaot Achronot, in Haaretz, and Jerusalem Post. In the mainstream, you're hearing those voices accusing the establishment of becoming fascist. I think it's an exaggeration, personally, but you know, liberal Zionists, when they get mad, they can really exaggerate. But the point is because it's targeting them finally. I mean, all what Israel has done for the Palestinians, 6 decades of ethnic cleansing, of massacres, of siege, of slow death in Gaza, is not that problematic. But some veneer of democracy is falling off Israel's face, and they go nuts. How can we face our colleagues in the States and in Europe? We will look like some third world dictatorship or some fascist regime. That's so embarrassing. to them. I mean, for their ego, it's horrific. We have to be sensitive to their ego. The other issue that always comes up when we discuss BDS is anti-Semitism. And I'm starting with the context rather than talking a lot about BDS because most of it is in the book. And I have no shame in promoting the book because all the proceeds, author's proceeds, are going to PACB, not to myself. So please buy the book. So you'll see all the discussion about the movement and the achievements and so on in the book. I'll go over that very shortly. But I want to discuss the issue of anti-Semitism, which I think is extremely important, especially in this country, because for some reason it maintains its effectiveness in deterring people from dissenting, from critiquing, from standing out of the line. Until now, it has this enormous potency that it has lost in many places, like Britain, for example, where it's meaningless when you attack a Jewish critic of Israel as a self-hating Jew. No one is deterred by that. But here in the US, it still carries a lot of weight. Clearly, it's not working with everyone, but it's still very effective, I think. So let's discuss that. Archbishop Desmond Tutu said in this context of the anti-Semitism smear, I think the West, quite rightly, is feeling contrite, penitent for its awful connivance with the Holocaust. The penance is being paid by the Palestinians, he says. I just hope again that ordinary citizens in the West will wake up and say, we refuse to be part of this, end of quote. Recently, a very senior Israeli diplomat, Ilan Baruch, quit the diplomatic corps in Israel, and he is a very important figure in the diplomatic corps. He had served many assignments, the last being ambassador to South Africa. He quit because he can no longer support the policy of the State of Israel. But regarding anti-Semitism specifically, he says, identifying the objection expressed by global public opinion to the occupation policy as anti-Semitic is simplistic, provincial, and artificial, end of quote. I love this provincial. You know, it's classy. And another very important figure, Avraham Burg, who's one of the leading Zionist figures in the last half century, I would say. He was the leader of the Knesset, the speaker of the Knesset for a long period. He was the head of the Jewish Agency for a long period. So not exactly your typical anti-Zionist, self-hating Jew. Avraham Burg had this to say, just to give some context, and then I'll move to his comments on the anti-Semitism issue, about his assessment of Israel in general. He says, from this point, the establishment of the State of Israel not only failed to solve the problems for the sake of which it was founded, but on the contrary, made them a great deal worse. Israel, Burg says, is the biggest shtetl in the history of the world. One big town around which walls of segregation and resentment rise higher every day, cutting it off from its surroundings. Few of us know any other existential reality apart from our unrelenting war with everyone, all the time, and over all issues, end of quote. Regarding the anti-Semitism issue, Burg says, Israel sweeps all the criticism against it, both justified and unjustified, under the same anti-Semitic rug. It is actually we, Israelis that is, who are repeatedly mixing up proper criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. The reason is to avoid at any price having to confront the situation and make tough existential decisions. The occupation, the injustices, the discrimination, the persecution of the non-Jewish minority in our midst. So far, Burg says, this has been enough to go on posturing against the world, based on a paradigm as addictive as it is erroneous, that the whole world is against us. It is a historical, moral, and emotional checking account that is suffering from being overextended and is on the brink of being closed. There is no other country in the Western world, he says, from which the international community has been willing to put up with acts of state violence for 5 decades, other than Israel. There's no other country that's permitted by the international community to maintain a vast, unsupervised nuclear arsenal, other than Israel. And there's no other colonialist left in the world, other than the only democracy in the Middle East. The world is still putting up with all this, he says, but not for much longer. It will soon be over. So what Burg is describing is really the loss of the hearts and minds that we're seeing all over the place. A recent BBC poll shows that among Europeans, Israel is viewed as competing with Iran, North Korea, and Pakistan over who's the biggest menace to world security. So that's the camp where Europeans are increasingly viewing Israel in. Thus, BDS has grown tremendously. This is the context that explains why BDS has grown tremendously. It's not just because it's supported by the great majority of Palestinian civil society. It's not just because it's based on international law and human rights, universal human rights, and is opposed to all forms of racism, including anti-Semitism. It's not just because we have partners even in Israel and everywhere else. It's growing in the global south, in the west, and so on. It's also because we have to give credit where credit belongs. The fanatic right-wing government of Israel has really helped. I mean, if we had a different, slightly liberal government, it would have taken us much longer. So when we started BDS in 2005, we had no idea we would be here at this point. Less than 6 years later, that we would have major trade union federations in South Africa, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Canada, France, in Belgium, and all over, in Brazil, in India, that we'd have such a massive support from trade unions. Last year, after the flotilla attack, the Palestinian BDS National Committee, which is the BNC, the leadership of the global BDS movement, which is a huge coalition of Palestinian civil society groups, called on dock workers' unions to block Israeli ships, not to load or offload Israeli ships, as a protest to the flotilla attack. This was heeded by the Swedish dock workers' union. The Norwegians initially started but retracted. Indian dock workers' union in Cochin, the fourth largest port in India. Turkish and even US dock workers' union in Oakland, California, observed it for 24 hours, and that is really appreciated. Quickly on the economic level, because many people say, okay, at the cultural level we can see the Pixies, Costello, all these great names boycotting Israel all of a sudden, or at least heeding the Palestinian call not to perform in Israel. Increasingly, this is becoming a very serious threat to Israel, that it's all the millions and tens of millions of dollars it's spent on the Brand Israel campaign to rebrand itself, to show itself as a state of high technology and fine arts and so on, has really failed. And many artists are not buying it, and they're not going to Israel. They're realizing that Tel Aviv today looks very much like Sun City did during apartheid South Africa. But at the economic level, it always comes up. Will this have any impact on Israel? Because Israel is a large economy. It's a very powerful economy. And it does produce so many things. It has so much trade. It's very integrated into the world economy. So can BDS have any hope? Because people will not join a movement that doesn't look very hopeful. Despite their moral convictions and so on, they'd rather spend their energy on something that has hope to achieve results. Well, BDS does not have hope. It is already achieving results. I'll just give one quick example on the economic side. Veolia, a French conglomerate involved in the Jerusalem Light Rail, it's a tramway that connects Israeli settlements, illegal settlements in the occupied territories with the city of Jerusalem. So 100% illegal project. In 2008, we launched a campaign from Bilbao in the Basque Country, Spain. We launched a campaign, Palestinian, Israeli, and European civil society organizations, to boycott Veolia, to deny Veolia contracts wherever it's operating due to its involvement in the Jerusalem Light Rail. And we threatened Veolia that you will lose a lot of money if you do not withdraw from this project. But of course we were posturing. I mean, we had no idea we could do that. It's a huge company working in some 50 countries with tens of billions of dollars of revenues, and we're a tiny civil society movement that's still growing. But less than 2 years later, Veolia had lost to the tune of $10 billion worth of contracts, mainly due to the BDS movement. Just before I came on this tour to the United States, news came from London that the City Council of South London excluded Veolia from a contract worth £1 billion. So that's to be added to the tally. And in many of those campaigns, the beauty of the BDS campaign is that it's based on individuals, citizens, civil society groups of all sorts, very diverse, committed to equal rights, that still